maybe a little different. It won't be as heavy, although I am going to go over a bit of a strategic briefing or political briefing for people here who are. Every Saturday we have these, usually a class and a political briefing. Mostly today's going to be the political briefing, and we'll be able to show you a little bit a certain kind of perspective on the global situation, not from the United States, since Leni and I just got back from a few weeks in Taiwan, which is sort of an interesting. It's a different place. It's not a huge country. It's about 28 million people, although in a very small space. For people who think the United States is too crowded, it's the only place I can think of in the United States that's close to it is New York City, because it's about 28 million people, but most of the island is mountains, and it's not particularly inhabitable. It's mostly around the coastal regions, and of course the main area is the northern tip of the island where Taipei is. So you'll get an idea of that. But it's also a place in a peculiar way. One way to start to get a perspective, despite its relative smallness, and it is not. It's one of the first of the industrialized countries in Asia. But over the years, particularly with the rise of mainland China in significance, Taiwan has, you could say, shrunk in its prominence, at least in terms of people. There was a time in the United States where Taiwan was a major focal point. If you go back to the 40s and the 50s, okay, and it's a very peculiar place from which to look at the whole post-World War II history and where we are today. Now, just to give you a little flicker of it, particularly for people who are a little bit younger, probably one of the closest points we came to conflict in the 1950s, perhaps even with the Soviet Union, but certainly it was a bit of a shooting war, if brief, between the United States and mainland China, was over Taiwan. And this is about 1958. The Taiwan armed forces, and I'll just take a step back to fill in the broadest sense what this was about, but the Taiwanese armed forces were generally trained at, including amphibious landings, etc., on the islands of Kinmen and Matsu, otherwise known as Quemoy and Matsu. They may have other names. And these were basically a couple of rocks, but they were being used as a training base for the Taiwan armed forces. And at a certain point, Mao Zedong ordered a bombardment of the training area. And this was Eisenhower was the president at the time, addressed the United States as a nation and said, we're prepared to defend Taiwan, otherwise sometimes known as Formosa. And so there was a point in history where this was a very intense area of conflict. Now, and indeed it remained so, I think, through into the 1970s and 80s, and really has only been diminished, though it's still a possible point of flare-up, has only been diminished since, you could say, the reforms and the development in mainland China, leading into the period now where mainland China, depending on how you look at it, is the second largest economy. These things are a little peculiar, okay? Because, for example, in terms of per capita wealth or per capita productivity, you're talking about a different situation. But the main point is that mainland China has undertaken, in the recent period, let's say about the last 30 years, the most intense economic development policy in terms of time span and number of people in history. I mean, never before in history have you seen a situation where a country, obviously of this size, presently the estimate is 1,357,000,000 people. Or to put it in some perspective, 4 times the size of the United States. Over 4 times the size. And the United States is the 3rd largest population on the globe. So you have basically China, India, the United States, and then Indonesia, surprisingly enough. Okay? So by even conservative estimates, 400 million people have been brought out of poverty in China. There's been significant, particularly in the last 10 or 15 years, significant industrial development, scientific development. And indeed, the policy of China today is unique in the prominence that it places.
I actually had the figures.
Oh, yeah?
In 1980, 85% of the population was in extreme poverty.
Mm-hmm.
Now it's 10%.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Okay, so you get an idea. That this is a process. And of course, in fact, the Chinese now have a satellite mission or an orbiter on the way to the moon. And with the idea that they will orbit the moon and then come back to Earth and land safely. Now, because they have a policy of developing their space capability and ultimately mining the moon. Now, what's really important about their perspective is that it's a perspective of development, ongoing development as the policy. So it's not just about the moon, it's mining helium, it's the development of fusion, but also ongoing cooperative development. Now, also Leni's going to go through some things in a little bit later. But one manifestation of this, to make the point about what we're doing, is that there was a conference in Europe, in Germany, that was last weekend. That conference was organized by the Schiller Institute, which was founded by Helga Zepp-LaRouche, Lyndon LaRouche. And Helga, in particular, has been an international emissary for LaRouche, the policies of the LaRouche Political Action Committee, policies of unique economic development, creation of institutions, and so forth. And so last weekend, what I can only do is recommend to people, first of all, reading some of the speeches or going to the Schiller Institute website and getting videos and audios of the speeches. But there were presentations there by Helga, by representatives from China, India, France, Serbia. I'm sure I'm forgetting a whole bunch of stuff, but you get the basic idea. And in other words, these are and in particular, the representative from China, the whole theme of the presentation was the idea of cooperative development. That it's not a matter of nations competing, it's not a matter of spheres of influence. And this was from someone who is a representative of Chinese policy. We have the same thing coming from India. Now, the way I'm going to present something a little different, I hope, which is the reason I brought up the role of Taiwan, particularly in the post-World War II period, is because in some respects, so again, these things, I don't mean a direct one-to-one analogy, but in some respects, what happened at the end of World War II, and what didn't happen, what did and didn't happen at the end of World War II, is to a large extent, you could say, the legacy that we live with today in the form of the areas of conflict. They generally, go back to World War I and or World War II. This was the legacy of the British Empire. It was the British Empire who organized World War I. Edward VII. It was the British Empire that put Hitler into power. It was the British Empire that, in a certain sense, tried to, you could almost say tried to lose World War II. Not quite. But they were happy to see the Germans and the Soviets fight it out on the Eastern Front and crush millions of people. They didn't really want to win the war too soon. And they didn't necessarily want to win the war in the East too soon. And they didn't want China to be a significant power. As I pointed out to some people in Taiwan, some of them may have known it and some not. The only reason China got a seat on the UN Security Council and was in the middle of the war brought in as one of the major allies. In other words, the big three was the United Kingdom, the United States, and the Soviet Union. By the end of the war, you had added to this China and then later even France. Now the reason China was brought in was Roosevelt. It wasn't Stalin. Churchill completely opposed it. He accused them of not fighting enough and so on and so forth. And Stalin was not particularly anxious to do it. It's worth noting that Stalin and Molotov, who was his foreign minister, when asked about sort of why they weren't supporting the Chinese communists more, said, well, we don't really think they're communists. They're not really hardcore communists. And in fact, there's only short periods of time when the Soviets and the Chinese, or the Chinese communists, it was somewhat mixed up at times, were allied. Once during the 20s and early 30s, and then again from about 1950 to 56. But otherwise, they were not allied. And in fact, they were in substantial conflict for various parts. So Stalin was not in support of China as a major force. What Roosevelt believed is that China had been an area of colonial looting, had been underdeveloped by the British colonial empire, and that it had the potential, given its history and given its population, to become and would become, under the right circumstances, a leading nation on the planet. Now, it's also the case that Roosevelt and a small number of people, around him, some people like Hurley, who was one of his envoys, Marshall, who was the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, and so on and so forth, wanted to bring China in. Because they saw this as typical of what had to be done globally with much of the so-called Third World. And that, of course, China has, along with India, has a somewhat unique, long-standing history. And you have to, in order to understand a great deal of what goes on today, you have to understand that. You have to begin to at least understand, what did Roosevelt want to do? He wanted to create a forum of cooperative development amongst the existing nations, and remember, the UN, when the UN was started, it was 44 nations. It's close to 200 today. Now, there have been divisions and so forth, but a good deal of it is that the entire colonial world over time was supposed to be given its independence. Now, as we know, much of that independence was given under conditions. IMF conditions, brutal economic conditions, free trade conditions. And these countries were not allowed to develop. But that was not Roosevelt's view, keeping in mind Roosevelt died before the war even ended. The British knew he was going to die. And they prolonged the war so that the negotiations over what would happen afterwards would not be affected by FDR. Now, Eleanor Roosevelt played a role after World War II in the efforts to put forward his policies, but obviously it was limited under the circumstances. In a sense, what is being proposed, for example, in the Silk Road, the Chinese proposal for a Eurasian land bridge, the World Land Bridge, which we'll give you a little bit of, this is a developed version that goes far more in the nature of the projects, the nature of the relations amongst nations, but it is an expression of the same outlook that was represented by the United States under FDR during and at the end of World War II. That's not what the United States represents today. What the United States represents today is the ongoing imperial policy of containment of China, in particular, containment of Russia, confrontation with Russia and China, in an effort to throw their development back and forestall any replacement of the existing dying transatlantic financial empire. The IMF, the World Bank, and so forth. Now, the reason this becomes important to get an understanding both of Taiwan and, in some sense, where it is today, which is not unlike places like Korea and so forth. China had its, you could say, its revolution in 1911. That is the introduction of the Republic of China under Sun Yat-sen. Now, the irony of the moment at the time and the period afterwards is that some of the people who ended up in Taiwan and some of the people who ended up running the mainland were allied at that time with Sun Yat-sen. Now, China was never really completely unified in the boundaries we know today under Sun Yat-sen, and Sun Yat-sen died in 1925. From about 1925 until 1949, the whole question of what was China going to be, what was it going to become, was up in the air. However, the underlying culture that Sun Yat-sen had stressed, because most people think of China as a battle between capitalism and communism, Chiang Kai-shek and Mao Zedong, or however you, Kuomintang and the Chinese Communist Party. That's only partly true, because Sun Yat-sen represented the American system. And indeed, scattered through both sides were representatives of the American system. So what occurred was effectively China was unified in the middle of the 1920s. Again, these are all, it's a whole different story. But China, as we know it today, was essentially pulled together during that period, even with the internal conflicts. But those conflicts ultimately posed a very serious problem, because the point is, you can't look at anything by itself. Because what happened to China? China was invaded by Japan. Now, in part, China was invaded by Japan as early as 1931-32. Manchuria, which became Manchukuo, and actually the emperor, who had been overthrown in 1911, was brought back by the Japanese to be the emperor of Japanese-controlled China, Manchuria. Now, by 1937, the Japanese had invaded into the core of China. Nanjing, Beijing, etc. Japan was occupying a good part of China, and this was the beginning of World War II. World War II in the Asian theater began 2 years before the official start of World War II in the European theater. The Asian theater began in 1937. The war in Europe was not on full tilt until September 1939. In effect, China was in the middle of war as you'll see from 1925 to 1949. So, the conflict in China took a certain form, which was the nationalist forces, which were at that point in control, and the communist forces fought each other and fought the Japanese. Now, there's a lot of history about who really fought the Japanese. I'm not going to go into this right now. But there was a constant conflict, both within China and at times a bringing together of China, the Chinese on both sides to fight the Japanese. The real enemy was Japan, but there was these existing problems. Now, I think there's a great deal to look at as to what, the typical right wing in the United States is, who lost China. In fact, this was a big story under the McCarthy period. The idea that it was communist penetration that led us to lose China. However, I think you have to look in a totally different place. You have to look at the role of the British after World War II. Their role in supporting Mao Zedong. FDR did not support the communists. FDR didn't exactly support Chiang Kai-shek, but he sent emissaries to try to work this out between the two of them and negotiated with Chiang. It was a faction in the State Department and a guy named Stilwell. And the British, who manipulated this in a number of different ways, including the education of Mao Zedong. One of the leading figures in China in the Communist Party was Bertrand Russell, who spent time in China around 1920, 1921, and was directly involved in promulgating this philosophical outlook. Now, the unique thing about the Communist Party is, under Mao in the 20s and then later, was that it's anti-Confucian. The student upheaval of May 1921 was anti-Confucian. The whole Cultural Revolution was anti-Confucian. So you have to, that's where you get a certain kind of divide. However, because of problems in the nationalist side of things, no doubt, and the consequence after World War II was that even though the nationalists were in control in 1945, by 1947 there was a civil war. And by 1949, and here you have one significant factor in this was the role that the British played in pulling back support for the nationalists. But by 1949, the communists had succeeded in the Civil War. And indeed, the nationalist forces relocated, you could say, in Taiwan. But of course, you have to realize how out of balance this is. Taiwan is a relatively small island, about today 28, 30 million people. China, even at that point, was over 500 million people. So, after the war, what was a point of conflict? The United States, from 1949 or so until the 1970s, did not recognize Red China. We recognized Taiwan as the government of China. And so this was a very intense point of conflict during that period. And as I said, could still be heated up. A lot of things have changed, as I said, with the development of China. But I think what's very interesting about this situation, and important, not just interesting, is that what's being proposed, and many people in Taiwan get this. Taiwan itself is somewhat split. But they recognize that what China is talking about now, in terms of economic development, in terms of getting people out of poverty, and in terms of relations to other nations, a different concept. So what you have in the West today, and it's only because of what's happened in the 20th century. This is not the West in toto. But in the West today, typified by Obama, is represented by an outlook which says the world is nothing but conflict. It's a zero-sum game. All there are spheres of influence. The gain by one person is a loss by another. The gain of one nation is the loss of another nation. Russia and China will never get along on the Eurasian land bridge because they will come to conflict over separate interests. So we don't have to worry about that. The Chinese are trying to project their control of the Asian Pacific. That's why they have an air identification zone. That's why they're working, with India. They're trying to extend their sphere of influence. Why are they doing what they're doing in Africa? They're trying to get natural resources from Africa as part of their national interest. They're going to be in conflict with us in Africa over these resources. The Western outlook is Adam Smith. It's competition, not development. That's the British imperial outlook, which has become hegemonic in the West, largely in the 20th century, but in particular since what LaRouche forecast, which was the breakup of the Bretton Woods agreements in 1971. Those agreements were flawed, but what replaced them was far worse. What replaced them is what you have today. Insane speculation, brutal reduction of living standards, looting of wages, destruction of infrastructure, and you could go on from there. The idea that China might be in Africa because they see some value in developing Africa, that this may be good for their own population, is considered, you're a fool if you think that way. Even the possibility is just naive sentimentality. And then, Bertrand Russell was, that's another story. Bertrand Russell, that's what he believed, that's what he taught. That's what's hegemonic in philosophy, psychology, in the West in general. The human mind is nothing but a machine. There's no difference between us and an animal. And I mean that in ways that you don't even, beyond what you may think. I mean that our impulses are the same. If we're attacked, we will kill to defend ourselves. We'll eat other members of our species. We have an inherent conflict over limited resources. Human beings are no different than any animal. We need food, we need to reproduce, we need some form of protection, and we will do whatever we need to do to get it. Now the fact is that's not what human beings are. But to the degree you let that, for example, be part of your culture, your entertainment, that's the outlook. That's why people would believe there couldn't be any reason other than conflict for China to want to develop any other nation. They're simply trying to take that nation out of our influence, out of our orbit, out of our economic. You saw this in Ukraine. Remember, what happened in Ukraine was they were going to sign an agreement with the European Union and the Eurasian Economic Union. Now the Russians said, go ahead, sign both. The European Union and the United States said, no, if you sign with Russia, you can't sign with us. And I think that typifies a quality of difference. You have to face the fact that, why has Obama generated one war after another? We have a situation now, I don't know if people realize this, I hope some people might. We have a situation now where there's a meeting of fusion scientists on fusion energy. Everybody is there except for the United States. Why? Because it occurred in Russia. And under the sanctions, our scientists can't go to Russia. There's meetings on controlling Ebola. LaRouche and his collaborator on this, Deborah Freeman, who's a public health doctor, have made the point that the United States and Russia should initiate a steering committee of international forces to deal with Ebola and similar situations. We won't do that. Why? Because the sanctions. We're at war in Syria. We're at war in Iraq. We were at war in Libya. And basically, we're threatening to go to war anywhere that doesn't conform to our definition of sovereignty. That's what this whole idea of going in on a humanitarian basis is. If they don't conform to our principles, then we're prepared, if we have the opportunity, to go to war. Take the case of Hong Kong. Does anybody realize that the basic agreement in Hong Kong was not that anybody could run? The basic agreement was there would be universal suffrage. You know what universal suffrage means? Anybody can vote. From the very beginning, the basic agreement said that there would be a committee or some representation that would choose who could run. It's the demonstrators that are breaking the agreement. Now, what do most Americans think? China has refused to give democracy to Hong Kong. This is a place that was a colony of the British Empire that never got to elect anybody for 100 years. Frankly, that's probably why most of the protesters are under 21 years old, because they don't know, frankly, their rear end from their elbow. They were born around the time of that Hong Kong was given up by the British Empire. So this is the kind of thing that you're witnessing. Now, what is the actual outcome of the West? Where are we? Well, look at this Ebola situation. And we have material in this because I'm not going to take the time. There's a statement by Deborah Freeman. We have other coverage on the LPAC website. And what you've seen develop, really, this is a good example. And it's also exemplified by the conference that I mentioned in Europe. Because there is in the world, there are forces, countries, some leadership, this is which do not want to go down the road to hell. They do not think that the nation that they represent should simply accede to being destroyed, to cheap labor, to the conditions of disease. And so there's a process of coming together. Now, what LaRouche and Helge, the point they've made in the recent period, is that in order to do this at the level that we're required, to bring nations to an actual agreement on developmental policy, on scientific progress, you have to fight for the identity of, well, what is the nature of mankind? You have to deal with this at the deepest level that you can. Human beings are absolutely distinct from animals. In the precise sense that we have a mind. And that mind generates creative insight into fundamental principles of the universe. A universe which is itself developing. It is a creative universe. It's not cyclical, it's not dead. It develops. New principles arise by the hand of mankind. Because we take things in the universe, and by understanding the principles, those processes come under our control. Therefore, we can do things that never happened before. We don't repeat the universe. We expand upon it, and that's how we survive as a species. And that's what the human creativity really is. It's the nature of the universe. As opposed to a view of the human species, which is, a dog-eat-dog world. My favorite expression of it is hyenas, but there are others that are equally useful. Rats. You know, corner a rat, it will fight. That's the nature of the animal world. Or, you know, another expression of the animal world, which is worth pondering, is the fact that in many mammals, you'll find that the male of the species, when it discovers the offspring of another male, will eat the offspring because it's not theirs. Their instinct is to kill anything that isn't its own offspring. That's the animal world. Is that wrong? Not really. That's what animals do. That's the only way they can live. There is development in the animal world, but it occurs by biological evolution. Human beings develop in a totally different way. Now look at what we have in this Ebola crisis. I don't know if this is going to be, but in 1974, LaRouche commissioned, or 73, 74, LaRouche, it came out in 74. LaRouche commissioned a study of the degeneracy that is imposed in the biosphere, in the area of life on the planet, overall, by the conditions of austerity of the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, etc. This is in the wake of the August 1971 collapse of the Bretton Woods system. And it's important because what we were looking at was not just the collapse of human living standards. Because what happens if humanity doesn't act to develop the conditions in which it lives, improve the qualities of energy that give us access to controlling the product of human activity, to changing waste into useful products, to developing new forms of productivity, then the entire biosphere collapses in quality. Lower forms of existence begin to feed off the detritus of human and animal activity. Bacteria, insects, and they feed off the dying aspects of the biosphere. And this is what makes disease. Because diseases aren't really diseases by their nature. They just do what they do. Viruses do what they do. Bacteria do what they do. They have a certain drive to exist and to develop through, not themselves, not consciously, but through their activity. Viruses don't say, gee, I want to be a bad virus, I want to kill a lot of people. They just are what they are. And so you produce a breeding ground for all kinds of viruses and bacteria, and the ones that make it are the ones that are able to feed off the existing life forms. And so you create disease. And what Lin forecast in 1974 is that we would create, by the degradation of whole sections of the human population, we would create new diseases. We would also create the conditions in which old diseases would come back. And we have that. Malaria is back. It's a bigger killer now than it was 20 years ago. Tuberculosis. These are all controllable diseases. But the conditions of life are that many of these people are too weak, or they don't get help, and so they die. Now these conditions become the breeding ground for new diseases. And the first well-known example of this was AIDS. And there's a great deal of mythology about AIDS to this day. Because in Africa, AIDS is not a disease of gays. It's a heterosexual disease, and it still is. It hasn't gone away. That was a disease that was created by these kinds of conditions, by the massive imposition of poverty, lack of development. In fact, the place where it grows the greatest is not in these quiet villages. It's in areas like Nairobi, or places, mining areas in southern Africa. Why? Because you have large numbers of men who come in. They're cheap labor. They come out of villages that have been essentially replaced by other forms of imported agriculture and so forth. Their life is dominated by grinding work and poverty in mines and other kinds of things. And what do you think they do at night or on weekends? And so that you get a spread of disease. Now, if you, for example, if you get a situation where Ebola, part of what's happened to Ebola is there have been about 20 outbreaks of Ebola. Known since 1976. Most of the time, it hits small villages, out somewhere, mining villages, and I think there's an irony in it because people are freaked by the high mortality, 50, 60, 70%. Now that's part of the reason it never spread before. It would hit a village, and the mortality rate was so high, there was nobody left to carry the disease, and they were isolated. Now what's happened is it's come into populated areas. And in part because of the breakdown of conditions. Remember, Liberia was a place of civil war for about 20 years. So was Sierra Leone. And so you've had this degradation of conditions, and now something like Ebola reaches a populated area. That's exactly what we said would happen, what Lynn said would happen. In fact, in some ways, this may be Lynn's most important forecast. Because this is at the root. The collapse of the economy. Helga made the point about 3 crises. The collapse of the economy itself, the crash of the financial system, the potential outbreak of disease in these conditions, and the threat of World War III. All of these are existential threats to the human species. And probably the combination more than anything. So now, what are we going to do? We have a president who basically says it's not a problem. Remember, they said no one was going to die. Then Duncan died. No one was going to get it. Then the 2 nurses got it. Well, I don't know if Ebola is going to be the disease. But what's the real problem? You can't stop this disease without stopping it in West Africa. You can't stop it at the border. You got to be a nutcase. They're going to monitor people's fever coming off an airplane. Many people who have the disease don't have a fever. Take an aspirin and your fever might go down. They're going to take people from the West African nations. They'll come in through somewhere else. Plus, what about the people in West Africa? And if you don't treat them, then they become a potential pool of Ebola, of other diseases, or whatever you want to think about. So the problem is Americans, and like this guy Ted Cruz from Texas, or these are carrying, the big solution is close the border. These people are idiots, and they're not idiots, they're immoral swine.
He's a Canadian, not an American.
Cruz, well, I think he's a citizen.
He's born in Calgary, so.
I know. Well, we may try to
claim him.
We may try to dump, but I think as a senator he has to be a U.S. citizen.
We're going to close the border and send him back.
All right. I mean, you get this from a bunch of people. Now, the fact that that's worth us recognizing. As I said, Roosevelt wanted a different approach to relations amongst nations. He had a different approach to China. And indeed, the Chinese are putting something forward. The Indians are putting it forward. And we had at our conference last week, probably in terms of a certain quality of intensity, the best representation of what is potentially afoot in the world today. But it's something we have to fight for. We have to demand that we treat the situation about Ebola seriously. I said it might not be the disease, but it might be a disease that kills millions upon millions. If we don't get on top of it, you can't, the threat that it might happen is there. And people are not going to run and hide from this. You know, if you want to have a bunker with dry tuna fish, the virus might be there. I mean, that's a critical factor for people to understand. Now, I think the factor that I want to get across is that what the Chinese have done on the Silk Road, on the Eurasian land bridge, what LaRouche, Helga, and Lin have done, what we've done as an organization, is on the agenda globally right now. So I'm not just saying there's a solution. I'm saying it's on the agenda now. It can be done, including in the United States. But we have to decide things like removing Obama, like turning the United States into an ally of this process, is something that's our responsibility, the responsibility of everybody in this room. And one thing I saw in Taiwan is in an area that was historically in conflict with mainland China, with these kinds of developments, that's not necessarily the case today. And we should not ever allow Taiwan to be a point of conflict. And the only way to do that is to bring the United States, and therefore forces with whom we're allied, or give some leadership, into this process. So I'll end it there. And Leni's going to have a few things to say, but if there's a question.
What were the flaws that you were referencing in the Bretton Woods system, and also what was the justifications at the time when they decided to take it down?
Well, I mean, the flaws, I think, is it really wasn't everything that Roosevelt wanted. You know, yes, it was a fixed exchange rate system, but the major flaw, that, for example, is that the World Bank was meant to be the major institution, which was supposed to make development loans to the third world. Okay, that didn't happen to any large degree, and the World Bank really became a secondary institution. The IMF, which was meant to be an accounting, was meant to be far the lesser of the two, and was meant to just be a certain kind of keeping records, so to speak, knowing what was going on, became the author of the conditions under which loans would be made. And it was those conditions that destroyed these countries. So, number one, that was one major flaw. There were other problems in the way, some of the monetary questions. It lent itself to a monetary or a monetarist interpretation. It was a monetary system. It wasn't an explicitly physical economic system. But I think the biggest thing that came up was the World Bank never really got off the ground because there was no impulse to really lead development. Now, what ultimately brought it down was there was already massive speculation in Eurobonds. There was an excess of dollars because there was a cutback in production. So dollars began to float internationally, uncontrolled and unregulated. This led to speculation in the value of the dollar and in U.S. bonds, and massive amount of debt. So the point came where, the British brought it down. They brought their own currency down, and then they basically said, the U.S. dollar isn't properly backed. A lot of this stuff floating out there. So at that point, the plug was pulled on the Bretton Woods. In effect, the U.S., Nixon and company went with it and said, okay, we're going to pull the plug on Bretton Woods, instead of saying this is a mess that needs to be straightened out. And this was a mistaken policy on the unregulated flow of what was then called Eurodollars. All right?
Yeah, I just want to ask Phil if you could reiterate a little more on this point you're making about what FDR wanted to do right away at the end of World War II in terms of colonialism.
Yeah.
And I'm just going to say a couple things and then see if this really, because I don't think I ever really appreciated that the fight in Taiwan was really between, both Taiwan and Mainland China is really the failure to go with that Roosevelt policy right away. It's really unfinished business from World War II that we're dealing with. I'm just going to tell a short story. One of my contacts for many years who supported LaRouche was in the OSS, assigned to help people in China fight the Japanese. And he was assigned to fly to Formosa to get, the Japanese apparently had a huge garrison in Formosa. That's where the command was. And he was assigned to fly solo.
Apart from Japan, that was the strongest hold that the Japanese had in all the Pacific. That was
Right, Formosa. So he's assigned to fly in there to get the Japanese to surrender August 15th, 1945. Later, he goes to meet Ho Chi Minh, because Ho Chi Minh was also fighting the Japanese, and Ho Chi Minh wanted to work with America. And for some reason, that was stopped right then, in 1945, because the Japanese were also in Hanoi, and the Japanese surrendered to this guy who was representing,
Right.
you know. So it seems to me it never actually came clear at the end of, right then, I mean, just literally, that it was still the British influence or whatever, colonial influence, and maybe that's still the overhang, because
It still is the overhang. I mean, look, the people who didn't want, and there were people in the State Department, but the people who did not want any alliance with Ho, for example, or other supposedly leftist, Sukarno after the war and so forth. This was the British. Look, Churchill was an insane anti-communist. He was one of the ones. He was the one who created the Iron Curtain in the Cold War. I mean, he for the British interest. This was, Fulton, Missouri, 1946, but it was already underway. He wanted U.S. troops to stay in Europe for years after the war. So that was where the impact came from, that we're not going to ally with this, of course, through certain also channels in the United States, like Harriman. Harriman played an absolutely rotten role in U.S. relations, for example, to the Soviet Union. It was Harriman. Harriman was the middleman.
Averell Harriman?
Averell Harriman, yeah. Okay. Now, Roosevelt, just to put it simply, Roosevelt's vision in his discussions with Churchill, in the Cairo discussions, in his discussions with Stalin, he's often accused of being soft. His whole point was, we have got to reach some set of sane relations, and if there's any way to do it, we should do it. That didn't mean he was going to give everything up. He wasn't going to shut the U.S. military down. But he felt that we were strong enough to come to some plausible means of working out. That was his idea of the UN. It wasn't a one-world government. It was a forum to debate international relations.
I think we can honestly say we wouldn't be having an Ebola breakout right now if Roosevelt's president would have been the same thing in Africa.
It would be a completely different world. Yeah. It's almost unimaginable. But you have to imagine a little bit. People. It's funny. You look at archaeology or paleontology, and you find, 10,000 years ago, you had this fantastic culture. What happened? How could they have given it all up? Why did it disappear? You have Indian culture, Chinese culture, South America, whatever. Look at us. What will people look at the United States? Maybe even as little as a couple hundred years from now, they'll look back and say, what happened? They went to the moon. They had major resources. They had nuclear power. They had 300 million people. And they're gone. How did it happen? That's somewhat the way you have to look at it. All right? All right.
We are back, but in the second half of November, I think I probably would give a presentation on Confucius, just to get a little bit more in depth, since this is something that Xi Jinping has taken up a lot, Helga, but so people have a more solid understanding on Confucius. So one of the things regarding China, I think is important. You might want to, Phil talked about the British Empire and the role of Stilwell and the British supporting Mao and so on. When you go to Asia, one of the things that really is striking is that suddenly your whole worldview changes because you're sitting in the smack middle of 3 billion people. It's like everything else kind of becomes very small in the rest of the world because this is power, this is people. And you could try to make an experiment. I would take, for example, a historical atlas and look at how China how China has been treated. There's been an effort to control Asia by the British for a very long time. And I gave a presentation earlier where this was exactly why John Quincy Adams and others sent missionaries over to Asia to counter the efforts from the empire to control Asia. And I think when we think about which Phil and I did a lot in Taiwan here in the presentations, when you think at the world land bridge, this is really an anti-imperial world map. This is the world of the future, which is for mankind. And like when Sun Yat-sen, he had succeeded in the revolution, he saw there was big efforts to make sure that China wouldn't succeed. And he makes a very beautiful statement. I don't have the notes here, but he makes a very beautiful statement, a call for help for the United States, where he says, what is happening in China now is what happened with the Civil War in the United States, where the British supported the Confederacy, and the idea was that to split America up in 2 parts, and then the empire could split America up in many more parts. And Sun Yat-sen says this is exactly what the British are trying to do with China now. And he called upon Americans to come and help us because they're trying to create a civil war. They're trying to split up China in at least 2 parts and maybe more. And this has been a live option. So you had when the Japanese, well, they invaded already in 1894. They were a tool for the British Empire. And then what Phil went through, how they then invaded again. But the whole idea was to use this as an effort to just divide and conquer and control most of Asia. If you control India and China, you have Asia. So, and then the idea was to have a communist north and a Kuomintang south. And then again, you could control it. China could be split up into several more parts and so on. This is still a live option. Some years ago, you could see in the magazine for Foreign Affairs how people were discussing, these so-called scholars and academics, if China should be split up. China should be split up in 5 parts or 7 parts. And you had in a really nasty creature whose influence is still felt today in Taiwan was Li Denghui, who was very closely allied with the people in Japan who wanted to split China up in several parts. And he was the one beginning to push for Taiwan's independence and see if there could be tension between mainland China and Taiwan. And he was followed by a guy called Chen Shui-bian, a really nasty creature who has now been in jail for a number of years. And what we found, Phil and I, when we were here, one of the ways they have done to try to see culturally to control Taiwan is that they have taken all morals and ethics out of the school textbooks. And instead what they're putting in is all kinds of things like civil disobedience, referenda, and so forth. As one guy said to us, they are like training people. And that guy was not like a socialist, red dye guy. He was like a conservative one from Kuomintang. He said, look, they're literally, he was a professor at the most important university in Taiwan. He said, they're literally training our young people to just be disobedient. And he had confronted some of these youngsters and said, look, you want just a Taiwan for Taiwan itself, and you're pushing this stuff, don't you think that's dangerous? Don't you think that's going to create a war? And this young kid, 20-year-old or something, would say, oh, I'm not worried because the United States is going to come and defend us. So totally silly. I want to take another aspect, namely that not only is China very old, China has made tremendous scientific and artistic breakthroughs. I mean, China invented, figured out concerning bronze production several thousand years before the West did. And it takes quite a bit when you begin to make alloys and so forth concerning science. And I could do a whole thing about that. But one of the problems has been all this, you've had all these invasions of China with the Mongols coming in. I mean, many times you had several hundred years of empire which was not Chinese, including the last one. This was not, they were invaded from outside, including combining with Tibet, and the Mongols collaborated invading China. So this is like ironic today when they said it doesn't belong to China. Well, they did it to themselves. They invaded China early in history. But the point I want to make is that, so you had all these invasions, you had some great Renaissance periods, and then you had a horrific period with the European countries, Germany, France, Britain, and so forth, carving up China, and then you had Japan invading, and then all the manipulations with Mao and the Kuomintang and so forth. And all the same, China remains very, very poor. And you had these peasants in China that would just live for many, many generations the same place and just try to just put food on the table for their families. What has happened now with China connecting the country, model upon Sun Yat-sen's program, where the entire nation is now being connected with these fast-speed rail, 4 main lines north-south, 4 main lines east-west, and then roads and so forth in between, is that the Chinese are beginning to look upon themselves as one country. One of the problems you had with the invasions of Japan and so forth was to mobilize people to fight, because there was not really an idea from the poor peasants of one country. So you've had, so this is one very important thing. Another thing is that what Helga keeps saying concerning Confucius, which is why I want to, time is not allowing it tonight, which is why I want to do it when we come back. Because there is a sense, a very proud sense, like you had when, for whatever different culture you come from, what it is to be Chinese. And very, sometimes you can be almost too much. We're the oldest, we're the best, we're the most. But now it is instead taking what Phil pointed out concerning developing other nations, to do good, to become friends through helping your neighbor. And therefore, there was just a poll being made in Taiwan where over half of young people below the age of 35, they would not mind going to mainland China and work. So there's, I mean, when I started going to Taiwan 20 plus years ago, nobody from mainland China could visit Taiwan. You couldn't fly from Taiwan into mainland China. It was not possible. You couldn't have a Taiwan student going in and studying at Beijing University or vice versa. Now you have over 1 million Taiwan business people living in mainland China. You have thousands and thousands of students from Taiwan and from mainland China who are studying in the two places, and now their papers count. Wherever they get the education, it counts. Before, when they began this whole process, if you got a degree in mainland China, it didn't count in Taiwan, but it counts now. When Phil and I arrived, it was hilarious because the mainland Chinese had a week holiday in connection with October the 1st. And then, of course, it was Double 10 Day, the 10th of October, celebrating the Chinese Revolution. So the mainland Chinese took the opportunity. So Taiwan was swamped with 50,000 mainland Chinese. It used to be so you could only go in a limited group under supervision when they started coming over, and now it's just, so when we were standing in lines to get through pest control, there was nobody else but people from mainland China in all the lines. We could see their passports, and they had these special papers when they come in. So this has completely shifted. And not what Phil pointed out, not that they cannot, you cannot create tension, but young people, most young people wants to have a future. Most young people get excited about development. So if you're a young person in Taiwan today, to think about all of mainland China and all of Asia, and that you have progress and development is a plus. Then of course you also have Xi Jinping, which I think is extremely important, calling for the artists of China to be serious, that they should not build ugly buildings, they should not play ugly music or compose ugly music and ugly paintings, but they have to live up to the standard of China's culture, which is extremely important, because what you've had in Japan in particular, and to a certain degree in Taiwan and mainland China, has been to take some of the worst of the culture from the West and then make it your own. And they're putting a stop to that. At the same time, of course, it helps with the tremendous progress for science, and it's in all scientific areas where they're now luring in talent from the rest of the world regarding laboratories and apartments and so forth, so they can come, whether it's health, agriculture, space, fusion. The Chinese are going for talent for all over the world to increase the process. And there, people from mainland China, particularly young people, are excited about that. But there's also another thing, that is, it's the same language culture. And the whole, so one thing I was going to say and it slipped my mind. It'll probably come back to me. Because the Chinese, well, no, I can't do that because they'll take confusion. So we'll just go to the light side now and then make some comments in between. Because you have in, let me show you, this is light and serious, so just a mixture, okay? I just literally pulled some pictures out very fast. Okay, so this is Phil with our two goddaughters. And so with, the one to the left is 19 and the one to the right is 17. And when they were born, you could not fly to mainland China. And this whole process, what I said, that was verboten. And now we had the opportunity to have a talk with them alone, which was really delightful, because we asked them about what they thought about mainland China. And they said, well, the students from mainland China, they are much better than we are, although we work as hard as they do. And if you have people going from Taiwan to mainland China, they come back, they're better than we are. And we used to be the best. And we also told a funny story, not by them, but by Yu Feng, former very close collaborator here, how Taiwan and mainland China has these competitions. So one competition was to wash feet of people. Wasn't it to washing feet? Yeah. How many people could you get together to wash other people's feet? And so Taiwan got, I don't know, 10,000 people to wash people's feet. But mainland China got many more, because it's just like a county in mainland China, so they have much more a pool. And some of the people we talked with, some of the professors said, of course, the mainlanders who tend to outpace Taiwan because there's a much bigger pool to take from. So anyway, and we had a talk with him where one of the things that was brought up is that if something is good for mainland China, if mainland China does something that is good for the world, then it's good. If Russia does something that is good for the world, then it's good. And other things like that. And so a few days before we were going to go home, we visited them again, and they gave us a written letter where they reflected over that. A very moving letter, because we had thought the discussion was very good, but they had reflected over it. So anyway, they're good kids. They're very good kids. So actually, yeah. So we were talking. We were we were asked to give a presentation each of 5 minutes at a UN meeting, which we did. Here we are standing. Yeah. And the only ones, see what happened with this meeting was, it started out pretty good with a movie which showed Ebola and wars and hunger, because there's going to be discussion about the era of conscience, and it was Teachers' Day, the United Nations Teachers' Day, and everybody were local, just local stuff, except for Phil and I. So, so that's, yeah, I want to touch upon that because this is, this Chinese letters there, Chen Xia Wei Gong. This is extremely important because this comes from from the rites, the Book of Rites that Confucius edited, and where he talks about a society in the future where you have no poverty, where the old and where people are taking care of each other, where the old people are taken care of, the children are taken care of. There's nobody that is stealing. You don't have to lock your doors. This is the great commonwealth, the society of the future. And in there is this saying, Chen Xia Wei Gong, that the world belongs to everybody. That Chen Xia means under the heaven, that is, in the universe we are all people and we should develop each other, and it's for all of us. And also embedded it is the advantage of the other. And this is really what the world language represents. It is a total anti-oligarchical, anti-imperial outlook, which is what Phil mentioned, what we had the possibility of doing. And here Phil is speaking. At least we could gang up because we made sure we talked right after each other, so we had 10 minutes together. So, okay, this is, oh, no, I think I had one in between here. Yeah, just hold on a second. I couldn't figure out to unzip it, and then just bear with me. Yeah, let me just show you this one too. Yeah, this is the crowd we talked to. So, let's see. Stupid! That was really stupid, I'm sorry. There it is. There we go.
That's it.
Okay, so we came to there. So just, as I said, something to be very light. The Chinese loves to eat. It's really a part of the culture. It's not like Americans eat. The Chinese really believe, and I have never gained weight whenever I have been in China, and you eat all the time. You cannot have a meeting with somebody without having lunch with them or out having dinner with them. And sometimes when you have to have both lunch and dinner outside the same day, it can be a little hefty. But you don't gain weight because the way real Chinese food is, not what we get in the China joints here. The Chinese think about food as medicine. They think about that this should be good, this should be healthy for you. And Phil took a little time for Phil to get used to it. This tea is very good. it purifies your blood. This fruit you should eat. And things. First he thought, but then he got a little bit used to it because that's the way Chinese think. And this is close to where we lived where this is a temple, and they love parties. So every weekend they'll just block off the street, and then they'll put up a big screen so they can watch movies, and they're preparing all day food, so they can have all kinds of food and watch movies and things like that. It's just life. It's just I love this kind of stuff. And then we went to the National Palace Museum where Chiang Kai-shek. Oh, that's a very important thing. Let me just make a little break here because Phil mentioned, this is another thing with the Chinese, because Phil mentioned this confrontation between mainland China and Taiwan over Kinmen and Matsu. There's actually more to it because, and if you don't follow me, just please say, but Japan occupied Taiwan. So you have China, and then you have Taiwan, and then you have the two little islands. Okay. So Japan occupied Taiwan, but not the two little islands. So when Chiang Kai-shek moved down to mainland China, to Taiwan, no, that doesn't help. So when he made down to Taiwan, and you had this fighting over these two little islands, there was a collaboration between Zhou Enlai and Chiang Kai-shek. And they decided to keep up the fight, but it was a bogus fight. Why? Because they wanted to ensure that it was thought about as one China. Because Marshall and others from the United States said, forget about these islands. Let's just concentrate on Taiwan. And Chiang Kai-shek and Zhou Enlai insisted that we should keep fighting. But what they would do is they would fight, and then they would keep a break so they could get new ammunition and food and so forth to the troops, and then would fight a little bit more. And in correspondence between Zhou Enlai's agent in Hong Kong and Chiang Kai-shek, that's what they discuss, that they had to keep up the fighting in order to ensure that everything is thought about as one China. The same thing happens with when Kitchener starts going to China. Zhou Enlai makes sure that Chiang Kai-shek, they were educated at the same military academy, Whampoa Military Academy. They were old buddies. So Zhou Enlai is the one who makes sure that Mao doesn't kill Chiang Kai-shek when Chiang Kai-shek is kidnapped. And Zhou Enlai makes sure when Kitchener begins to come to Taiwan, or Kitchener to mainland China, that Chiang Kai-shek is briefed in detail about what Kitchener is saying, what mainland China intend to say, and so forth, so that Kitchener would not fool the Chinese, because the key thing for the Chinese was one China. And what Chiang Kai-shek writes in his memoirs, or in his diary, is that, of course, I never intended to go back and take back mainland China. That's completely silly and idiotic. But the reason we had this campaign for decades was to have the idea of one China. So the whole, if you think about an old culture that, like China's, with the same language culture that has been attacked by colonial forces again and again through the centuries, you do have this very strong concerning one China. And what Chiang Kai-shek did before, several months before, when the US had decided to recognize mainland China, he pulled the Taiwan representatives out of the UN because he didn't want to have a fight. Because, again, one China. So I think that's also important for people to kind of have an idea concerning how the Chinese think about it. I got to remember that because this is from the Palace Museum where Chiang Kai-shek got out most of the treasures from Beijing so that they were not destroyed by the Japanese and by the Red Guard. And then they hid them in the mountains in Taiwan. and now they are on display where they shift the exhibitions all the time. But the reason I put this up, I told you it was going to be light. This is a enhancing device. You can take many more selfies. This is and you have all kinds of enhancing devices for taking pictures of yourself. It's completely yeah, it's what it is. I haven't seen it here yet, but it's probably going to come. Yeah, so this is inside. This is Sun Yat-sen. And over there you have the Chinese says Bo Ai. And this Bo Ai is in Sun Yat-sen's handwriting. So I just thought it was, Bo Ai means universal love, universal brotherhood. So I just thought that was neat. Anyway. This is the Sun Yat-sen Memorial in Taiwan. And here we have him, Sun Yat-sen. And
looks very
he's
Lincoln-esque.
clearly modeled upon Lincoln and the Lincoln Memorial. And also his hands and his feet, it's not stiff. They're trying to see there's a little movement in it. So what I want to show. So remember this stamp we have used many times, the blue stamp with the map of China in the background that was used to raise money from 1942. Well, there was more stamps. So and this was in an exhibition, so I took pictures of it. Lincoln and Sun Yat-sen. And so you have several, you have one stamp there and one, so it's different stamps. So they took the star and, anyway, I'll go on. This is the original on the International Development of China book, upon which we modeled our Eurasian language and then the world language, okay? And there you have the railroad map in China, okay?
From 1920s.
1919. This is very important because Sun Yat-sen sent this out a few months after the Versailles Treaty. And we keep writing it wrong. It was 1919, and we know it for sure too because the US response came also in 1919. US responded right away and said, we can't afford it. Exactly what the monetarists are saying today, right? We can't afford development. So, and here you have Chiang Kai-shek. This is also like Lincoln, which is modeled upon that. And this is outside, it's just very beautiful. On one side you have the opera house, and then you have the theater. Very nice concert halls and gardens. This is one of our very, very good friends who goes to mainland China all the time. He was a big fighter against Li Denghui and was thrown out of the KMT Central Committee because of that. So and there you have Yu Fang. Some of you remember Yu Fang? Yes, she's totally with us. She's totally with us. And here Phil is giving, first I gave a presentation, and then Phil for a smaller group at a business. And this was just hilarious because here it says energy flux density global measure for economic progress. And then there's a little quote from Kuznetska and so forth about the LA and so on. So I had just sent it in the email, so they wrote the whole thing up and then a whole big thing about Lin, about Phil, that was a good slip, about how the most important thing was he'd worked with LaRouche for the last 45 years. And then they wanted to have a picture of their invitation with Phil. And so Phil did that, but then what they did is they took it to use it in a certificate of appreciation in Chinese. So we have that. It's kind of funny to use this picture. Yeah. So, but also, this is very different when you are outside the United States because the lady who introduced Phil, this professor here, this lady, she made into a whole thing about economic states, economists and statesmen, Lyndon LaRouche, that Phil was going to present the key principles of his idea of energy flux density and things like that. So very straightforward and so on. So here is Phil going through the triple curve. We took that in Chinese just to help people a little bit. And, oh yeah, that is goodbye. Anyway, I just thought it was sweet. And there we are. No wine. The only wine. We thought we were going to have wine because they told me, because they know I like a glass of wine. And what they had done then was they had cooked red wine with onions. And then you just get a little bit because to lower our blood pressure. And I looked at Yushen, who was the mother. I said, look, my blood pressure is great, and so is Phil's. And because we were older people, so we should have this awful tasting thing to lower our blood pressure. So anyway, this is the two goddaughters' father sitting there, and then this is the grandmother. Yufeng's mother. Oh yeah, that's very light too. This is an economist couple that we met. They took us out, as Chinese do, to a dinner, a vegetarian restaurant. And this is my main meal. It was delicious. This is mushrooms.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, just the way it was served. I got a good eating out of it. And here they are. Yeah. You see my mushrooms? They're standing right there.
Yeah.
It's hilarious. Yeah. Anyway, and there's a lot of people and squids. I had to control myself not to. Actually, I have many more pictures of food, but
They're like fried then?
yeah, they're fried.
They're huge.
It's huge, yeah. Actually, then what they do is it's very cheap, and then they stand with a big Chinese knife and boom, 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 and then you get it in a cup, chopped up pieces. And then this is a place that is very famous for all kinds of preserved eggs and other eggs and little eggs, and so there they are making these eggs on sticks. But then I control myself, not mine. And you know, this again, this is Taipei, tons of people. And here, these two guys, I've shown you a picture of them before. These two guys were at the conference with Helga in 1996, and they played a crucial role in ensuring that she could speak. Because the people from Britain did not want Helga to speak at the conference, and they intervened very forcefully. And they ran something called the World Bridge Foundation, being a director and vice director of it. And this guy, Joe, very good friend, he also gave us some stuff that was very good for our blood and his wife was furious because the first dinner they took us out to, she thought it was not healthy enough and clean enough. So she was in mainland China when we came to see him a second time. So she had ordered him to which restaurant we should go to so we could get the best for the health and the purest and the cleanest. I'm not making this up, right? Yeah.
True.
So, but Joe, who is Phil's age, he hardly has gray hair, and his father worked with the Flying Tigers. So they were up in the northern China, and then Joe's mother, who had 5 children, they got she couldn't find her husband anymore because he was all over the place. So she walked from the northern China to Nanjing, which is a long walk. What would that be in America? It would be like walking from Detroit to New York or something. Yeah. With 5 children. And Joe was a little baby, and there was no food because of all the war and so forth. So what she would do, she would go in the field and pick things and chew it and give to her baby. But nonetheless, he is a very healthy person. But gives you somewhat of the background also of some of these people, because it's a hefty history. Because people came from all of mainland China with Chiang Kai-shek and settled in Taiwan. Like our goddaughters, for example, their father might be a general next year. So they cannot go to mainland China, at least not for the time being. I'm sure they'll make it sometime in the future, but not now, because he's a general.
He's a colonel
Yu Feng's, yeah, he's a colonel now. Yu Feng's father came from mainland China with Chiang Kai-shek. This guy is from Manchuria. So this also means, of course, in Taiwan you can get food from all of China, because they brought the food culture with them too.
Now, actually, Joe's father was part of the crew that rescued people from the Doolittle raid.
Oh, yeah.
Because the Doolittle, the bombers couldn't get back to the aircraft carrier. They were told to just fly into North China. And they were picked up. Anyway.
So it gives you some kind of a sense of the history too, that these people have it in their identity, right? And yeah, I'll just finish with that up, and then if you could turn on the light, because it was very delightful for me. I've gone to Taiwan a lot. I mean, I started in '91, and I would go. In those days, I'll go twice a year, 1 month at a time, and always alone. And I had to find certain tricks also. If you get stuck in a discussion, I had certain tricks how to get unstuck and things like that, because it's totally different when you're two people organizing. So this was very delightful to have another organizer in terms of Phil. And then, of course, he really charmed the ladies because he's a round eye, and you don't see a lot of foreigners there. And so, I mean, the goddaughter thought he was so handsome. And then there was one economic professor, female too. She said, Leni, it's not to make you upset, but I think Phil is a much better speaker than you are. So anyway, so and then we were meeting with a blogger, a 30-year-old something blogger, actually for 3 hours.
Yeah.
Oh, I have to show you another picture too. Anyway. And so Yu Feng says to me, Phil is really going for it. And so Yu Feng says, vesves, I have a great name for Phil. So when we are finished with it, I asked, okay, so what's the name? So here is Phil's name. So actually this is not the right way of doing it. Well, you have to, this doesn't belong to the character, okay? This black line. So this is the character. This is the last name, right? Lu. You see, this is the same as this one. See, that's the same. Okay, Lu. So this is my name. So Phil got my last name, Lu. Okay, which means continent, strong. And then he got his own first name, Fei Lu. Fei, because this means wind. Because Yu Feng thought his organizing was so good that it was like the wind that could move continents. So I thought that was but I want to show you another picture that I didn't get because it was a little video, so it didn't come out. See here, where is it now? Here we go. This is a wild guy. We met with him for 6 hours, and then of course we had dinner with him. And the waiter tried to take several pictures, but every single picture came out as a little video. He didn't know what he was doing. So this is a little video, you see here. Okay. We were making a toast for a new just world economic order. I'll just play it one more time. He's an old friend too. This guy was the one who was out here in 2002 when Lin was the featured speaker. If you can remember
He went out
his
with
face.
he went out with us, with
Yeah.
the younger guys. Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, what's going on? Okay. So, I guess we can... That was it. I said it would be very loose. So, but very good people, very big openness. The thing is that, like here, like what people's idea is about China and Asia as a whole and so on, or Europe for that matter, people's idea about what's going on in the West, they really need us to both interpret Confucius and interpret what is a new just world economic order. When I say interpret, it's a little bit like we have to help Americans understand what the founding principles really are of the United States, what the principles are. We can help the Chinese to understand on a higher and deeper level the international implications of the ideas of Confucius. The same what we have done in Europe with Schiller and Husserl, because of who we represent as an international philosophical organization and our view of man, where people are not really, well, they're capable, but they don't have the tools to understand the nature of man and man's relationship to the universe in the most profound manner. But we are, and that's our job, to kind of make sure everything is coming together, and then they can do all the work. Oh well, we have to do a lot of work too. So anyway, so that's what I wanted to say. Any questions or comments?
Where do we begin?
Huh?
Where do we begin?
No, it's fun. People, it's fun to work with different people, I find.
Does
Yeah.
Chinese medicine treat viruses differently, like the Ebola? Because Chinese medicine is awful, not awful, but it's often, it's not allopathic where they treat a symptom, but it's usually something else where they'll more treat the body to heal instead of try to kill the disease. Is that right?
Yeah.
So
Actually, I tried one friend I had who died of hepatitis C. They are very good in some areas, like liver diseases, for example. So I had organized some Chinese that he could go to Hangzhou, to where they would treat, not the disease, they would treat the liver. He was too scared to go though. I had organized the whole thing, including he only had to pay what the Chinese had to pay and so on. But one of the things you have now is that you have several places on the West Coast, and I believe in Vancouver, Canada, where you have investigation into why some of the Chinese medicine functions, because it has not really been scientifically proven. So they're working on that now. And then you have a bunch of doctors who are both Western and Chinese trained. Like the guy you might remember in the Chinese black suit, with Phil and me in the middle, and then a little Chinese lady out to the side. He is trained both in traditional and Western medicine. He's a doctor. I mean, some of it is crazy. I know I've gone a lot to Chinese pharmacies. One of the first things I brought back years ago, because I thought it was so hilarious, I heard this guy talk in the pharmacy. It's also fascinating places to go, a Chinese pharmacy, right? So anyway, so I was in there, and he was telling a customer how this specific device would turn white hair black. So I said to him in my best Chinese, I said to him, look, will it also turn at that time I had red hair, so I said to him, well, when I get white hair, will it also turn my white hair black? And he said, absolutely, it'll be really black. I thought the whole thing was so hilarious. So I got these concoctions that I cooked up in New Jersey. Remember that, Phil? For people to drink so that they would get gray hair. And then you have crazy things too. I remember one time where you can eat pearls, little pearls, special kind of pearls, which would make your skin look beautiful. Obviously, maybe it's good for the digestion or something, but there's also some things that are really good. So I like this, that there's been investigation now in using Western methods to test out why it functions. So, anyway, you were going to say something?
Well, there were several things I wanted to ask about, but let me just pick one right at the moment. The only thing I haven't heard anything mentioned about tonight is Tiananmen Square.
Mm-hmm.
And right immediately after the thousands of people died there, I put out a special edition.
Can I interrupt you? Because I just realized what time it is. Basically have to. Anyway, Tiananmen Square is a very legit question. Tiananmen Square was very, it was, you know, students that were very well-meaning and things like that, and they had a number of points of what they wanted to have through the government, some demands. And the government gave into all their demands, accepted all their demands, and they met with the government representatives, met with the student leaders and so forth. Then it was taken over from outside. It was taken over from Hong Kong and otherwise. You had rock bands being flown in, tents being flown in, and originally, in the beginning of the Tiananmen Square, the students that were the leaders had been elected by the different student bodies. So they were elected by the other students to be the leaders. When they had gotten all the demands through that they had demanded from the government, the local leaders said, okay, we call a stop to it now, we should all go back to the universities. But at that time it had already been taken over by people being flown in from outside, and you had people that had not been elected or anything just taken over, leading the whole thing. Where it really escalated was with the hunger strikes. You might remember Chai Ling was one of the leading hunger strikers. And she did an interview, which I watched both audio and video, also with Chinese to make sure I didn't misunderstand it, where she's asked, so what are you doing? Why are you doing this? She said, well, we are having this hunger strike because we want to create a bloody shirt. We want to have a confrontation with the government where it creates blood, so we can put up the bloody shirt and we can have a revolution in China. And the next question to her is, well, are you preparing to die? They said, no, I already have my American visa and my escape route out of China. Indeed, several hundred visas were issued by Winston Lord at that time, who was at the US Embassy in Beijing, to the so-called student leaders in Tiananmen Square. And indeed, Chai Lin ended up in Princeton, and you never heard from her any longer. I know all that from a guy who was in jail for 5 years, who was one of the leaders of Tiananmen Square. He went through what had been happening. So what you had was something that was not bad being taken over, which we have seen many, many times, in order to stop China from developing, to have the old hardliners come in and stop the development of China. That's what happened. So
it went bad.
huh?
It went bad.
It was taken over. It was a so-called color revolution. It was taken over from outside in order to use something that is fine and so on, and use it to stop. The idea was to get the old hardliners back in China. That was one of the key.
Really?
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. So, yeah. Well, it has, every time you have this stuff going on, you have to ask who benefits, why. For example, the sunflower demonstrations, I was in Taiwan here in the spring, what they accomplished was to stop a trade pact with Mainland China. There was supposed to be a trade pact made, and that was cancelled, at least for the time being, because of these demonstrations.
At the time,
And this was also, right now in Taiwan here, outside intervention. Outside, like what we had in Ukraine, it was just a much more smaller scale. But totally.
at the time of Tiananmen Square, was communism, hardline communism, already starting to crack?
There's not really ever been hardline communism. I mean, Phil had a funny point with some of our contacts in Taiwan, and they laughed and said that's true, they were never communists. I mean, you had an effort to destroy the very core of Chinese thinking through Mao. I mean, if you think about it, you had, yeah, but you had before that, you had let the 100 flowers grow, where they called upon people to come out and say what they thought was wrong, what could be changed, getting ideas and things like that. And then people came out and said what they thought could be changed, and they were killed or put in prison. Then you had the Great Leap Forward, where now we're going to make steel in all the little villages. And people should come with their pots and pans and agricultural tools so they could be smelted or melted, and we could make steel. That meant that the farmers left their land. Alone in Anhui province, which is like just outside of Shanghai, 30 million people died in 1 year. People died so they were just lied in the ditches because of hunger. After that, you had the Cultural Revolution. So it was real where all classical, Western classical music was banned. Confucius was banned. Anything precious, the Tang Dynasty, a wonderful Renaissance period in China with beautiful poetry, was banned. So the first sign I really saw where it was coming back was the Olympics in 2008, because there was all these things that had been banned that was displayed at the opening ceremonies from the Tang Dynasty and so forth. So there was a real effort to destroy China from within. In a certain way, if you want to destroy a nation, you can destroy its culture. And in that way, see if you can. So that's why I think it's important we take up Confucius later. So it was a very much an imperial tool to destroy China.
Did the British ever succeed in literally dividing the country into north and south?
No, because the communists took the whole thing.
Did that create a conflict with Britain, or was that...
No, that's not how it's functioning. The idea is to let people destroy themselves. Let people fight in civil wars. Let's split countries up. Let's have cultural warfare.
Yugoslavia.
Like you can see the cultural warfare here, with what people take for entertainment and the drugs and so forth, which means that you take over the nation without doing it. It's just a different. This is what several individuals told Helga when she was on the latest trip, that America has a cultural revolution, that the nation is destroying itself from within. And Chinese people would say that to Helga, you know. And when Helga was there earlier in '96, one of the things that she reflected over was Nazi Germany, concerning that it was the same thing that happened there, with the total destruction of the most precious from within in Germany through Hitler and the Nazis.
Can I ask something about the Formosa Strait and the Seventh Fleet?
Yeah.
For years, I believed that the reason the Seventh Fleet, the U.S. Seventh Fleet, was positioned there was to block Chiang Kai-shek, who I'm not saying necessarily was a nice guy, but he had 600,000 well-trained troops that wanted to take back the nation.
No, they didn't want to take back. It was all a scheme to think about one China. Yeah, and that's fascinating. Chiang Kai-shek wrote a dictionary for as long time as John Quincy Adams. He's not by no stretch of imagination John Quincy Adams.
Yeah.
But very nasty operations was done, particularly with Stilwell and other operations. You could have had a different outcome and not a civil war, in my view, but that's my view. But according to Chiang Kai-shek's diaries, again and again, and then letters back and forth, this whole process I said regarding communication between Zhou Enlai and Chiang Kai-shek to make sure that the Chinese were not split up, the whole fake battle at Kinmen-Matsu to keep it going, so that to the idea of one China. And it's pretty wild, because I've seen these speeches of Chiang Kai-shek where he talks about take back mainland China, take it back, we are preparing. And he writes several times in his diaries that, of course, that's totally silly.
Where can I get more information on this?
You can read a book called Denonissimo Chiang Kai-shek. It came out a couple of years ago. Because that's, to my knowledge, the first time a person had read all the diaries of Chiang Kai-shek. Because I didn't know that. And I thought, well, that makes total sense. Because it's ridiculous to think that you can take back mainland China. So I always thought it was somewhat silly, right? But that makes total sense to me, that if you want to have an idea of one China, and that I think is very important for people to kind of, that's how Chinese people think. The people that are for independence in Taiwan are mostly people from the southern part of the island, uneducated, cab drivers, farmers, peasants, and so forth.
And you said the British were behind that too a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, whatever bad the United States is doing, the British are behind. We are just a puppet of the United States.
The British.
Oh, of the British, I mean. Yep.
What the United States represents today is the ongoing imperial policy of containment of China, in particular, containment of Russia, confrontation with Russia and China, in an effort to throw their development back and forestall any replacement of the existing dying transatlantic financial empire. The IMF, the World Bank, and so forth. Now the reason this becomes important to get an understanding both of Taiwan and in some sense where it is today, which is not unlike places like Korea and so forth. China had its, you could say, its revolution in 1911. That is the introduction of the Republic of China under Sun Yat-sen. Now, the irony of the moment at the time and the period afterwards is that some of the people who ended up in Taiwan and some of the people who ended up running the mainland were allied at that time with Sun Yat-sen. Now, China was never really completely unified in the boundaries we know today under Sun Yat-sen, and Sun Yat-sen died in 1925. From about 1925 until 1949, the whole question of what was China going to be, what was it going to become, was up in the air. However, the underlying culture that Sun Yat-sen had stressed, because most people think of China as a battle between capitalism and communism, Chiang Kai-shek and Mao Zedong, or however you, Kuomintang and the Chinese Communist Party. That's only partly true, because Sun Yat-sen represented the American system. And indeed, scattered through both sides were representatives of the American system. So what occurred was effectively China was unified in the middle of the 1920s. Again, that's a whole different story. But China, as we know it today, was essentially pulled together during that period, even with the internal conflicts. But those conflicts ultimately posed a very serious problem because the point is you can't look at anything by itself. Because what happened to China? China was invaded by Japan. Now, in part, China was invaded by Japan as early as 1931-32. Manchuria, which became Manchukuo, and actually the emperor, who had been overthrown in 1911, was brought back by the Japanese to be the emperor of Japanese-controlled China, Manchuria. Now, by 1937, the Japanese had invaded into the core of China, Nanjing, Beijing, etc. Japan was occupying a good part of China, and this was the beginning of World War II. World War II in the Asian theater began 2 years before the official start of World War II in the European theater. The Asian theater began in 30, maybe a little different. It won't be as heavy, although I am going to go over a bit of a strategic briefing or political briefing for people here who are. Every Saturday we have these, usually a class and a political briefing. Mostly today is going to be the political briefing, and we'll be able to show you a little bit a certain kind of perspective on the global situation, not from the United States, since Leni and I just got back from a few weeks in Taiwan. which is sort of an interesting. It's a different place. It's not a huge country. It's about 28 million people, although in a very small space. For people who think the United States is too crowded, it's the only place I can think of in the United States that's close to it is New York City, because it's about 28 million people, but most of the island is mountains, and it's not particularly inhabitable. It's mostly around the coastal regions, and of course the main area is the northern tip of the island where Taipei is. So you'll get an idea of that, but it's also a place in a peculiar way. One way to start to get a perspective, despite its relative smallness, and it is not. It's one of the first of the industrialized countries in Asia. But over the years, particularly with the rise of mainland China in significance, Taiwan has, you could say, shrunk in its prominence, at least in terms of people. There was a time in the United States where Taiwan was a major focal point. If you go back to the 40s and the 50s, okay, and it's a very peculiar place from which to look at the whole post-World War II history and where we are today. Now, just to give you a little flicker of it, particularly for people who are a little bit younger, probably one of the closest points we came to conflict in the 1950s, perhaps even with the Soviet Union, but certainly it was a bit of a shooting war, if brief, between the United States and mainland China, was over Taiwan. And this is about 1958. The Taiwan armed forces, and I'll just take a step back to fill in the broadest sense what this was about, but the Taiwanese armed forces were generally trained at, including amphibious landings, etc., on the islands of Kinmen and Matsu, otherwise known as Quemoy and Matsu. They may have other names. And these were basically a couple of rocks, but they were being used as a training base for the Taiwan armed forces. And at a certain point, Mao Zedong ordered a bombardment of the training area. And this was Eisenhower was the president at the time, addressed the United States as a nation and said, we're prepared to defend Taiwan, otherwise sometimes known as Formosa. And so there was a point in history where this was a very intense area of conflict. Now, and indeed it remained so. Creation of institutions and so forth. And so last weekend, what I can only do is recommend to people, first of all, reading some of the speeches or going to the Schiller Institute website and getting videos and audios of the speeches. But there were presentations there by Helga, by representatives from China, India, France, Serbia. I'm sure I'm forgetting a whole bunch of stuff, but you get the basic idea. And in other words, these are and in particular, the representative from China, the whole theme of the presentation was the idea of cooperative development. That it's not a matter of nations competing, it's not a matter of spheres of influence. And this was from someone who is a representative of Chinese policy. We have the same thing coming from India. Now, to get the way I'm going to present something a little different, I hope, which is the reason I brought up the role of Taiwan, particularly in the post-World War II period, is because in some respects, so again, these things, I don't mean a direct one-to-one analogy, but in some respects, what happened at the end of World War II, and what didn't happen, what did and didn't happen at the end of World War II is, to a large extent, you could say, the legacy that we live with today in the form of the areas of conflict. They generally, go back to World War I and or World War II. This was the legacy of the British Empire. It was the British Empire who organized World War I. Edward VII. It was the British Empire that put Hitler into power. It was the British Empire that, in a certain sense, tried to, you could almost say tried to lose World War II. Not quite. But they were happy to see the Germans and the Soviets fight it out on the Eastern Front and crush millions of people. They didn't really want to win the war too soon. And they didn't necessarily want to win the war in the East too soon. And they didn't want China to be a significant power. As I pointed out to some people in Taiwan, some of them may have known it and some not, the only reason China got a seat on the UN Security Council and was in the middle of the war brought in as one of the major allies. In other words, the big three was the United Kingdom, the United States, and the Soviet Union. By the end of the war, you had added to this China and then later even France. Now, the reason China was brought in was Roosevelt. It wasn't Stalin. Churchill completely opposed it. He accused them of not fighting enough and so on and so forth. And Stalin was not particularly anxious to do it. It's worth noting that Stalin and Molotov, who was his foreign minister, when asked about, sort of why they weren't supporting the Chinese communists more, said, well, we don't really think they're communists. They're not really hardcore communists. And in fact, there's only short periods of time when the Soviets and the Chinese, or the Chinese communists, it was somewhat mixed up at times, were allied. Once during the 20s and early 30s, and then again from about 1950 to 56. But otherwise, they were not allied. And in fact, they were in substantial conflict for various parts. So Stalin was not in support of China as a major force. What Roosevelt believed is that China had been an area of colonial looting, had been underdeveloped by the British colonial empire, and that it had the potential, given its history and given its population, to become and would become, under the right circumstances, a leading nation on the planet. Now, it's also the case that Roosevelt and a small number of people, around him, some people like Hurley, who was one of his envoys, Marshall, who was the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, and so on and so forth, wanted to bring China in because they saw this as typical of what had to be done globally with much of the so-called Third World. And that, of course, China has, along with India, has a somewhat unique, long-standing history. And you have to, in order to understand a great deal of what goes on today, you have to understand that. You have to begin to at least understand, what did Roosevelt want to do? He wanted to create a forum of cooperative development amongst the existing nations, and remember, the UN, when the UN was started, it was 44 nations. It's close to 200 today. Now, there have been divisions and so forth, but a good deal of it is that the entire colonial world over time was supposed to be given its independence. Now, as we know, much of that independence was given under conditions. IMF conditions, brutal economic conditions, free trade conditions. and these countries were not allowed to develop. But that was not Roosevelt's view, keeping in mind Roosevelt died before the war even ended. The British knew he was going to die. And they prolonged the war so that the negotiations over what would happen afterwards would not be affected by FDR. Now, Eleanor Roosevelt played a role after World War II in the efforts to put forward his policies, but obviously it was limited under the circumstances. In a sense, what is being proposed, for example, in the Silk Road, the Chinese proposal for a Eurasian land bridge, the world land bridge, which we'll give you a little bit of, this is a developed version that goes far more in the nature of the projects, the nature of the relations amongst nations, but it is an expression of the same outlook that was represented by the United States under FDR during and at the end of World War II. That's not what the United States represents today. I think, through into the 1970s and 80s, and really has only been diminished, though it's still a possible point of flare-up, has only been diminished since, you could say, the reforms and the development in mainland China, leading into the period now where mainland China, depending on how you look at it, is the second largest economy. These things are a little peculiar, okay? Because, for example, in terms of per capita wealth or per capita productivity, you're talking about a different situation. But the main point is that mainland China has undertaken, in the recent period, let's say about the last 30 years, the most intense economic development policy in terms of time span and number of people in history. I mean, never before in history have you seen a situation where a country, obviously of this size, presently the estimate is 1,357,000,000 people. Or to put it in some perspective, 4 times the size of the United States. Over 4 times the size. And the United States is the 3rd largest population on the globe. So you have basically China, India, the United States, and then Indonesia, surprisingly enough. Okay? So by even conservative estimates, 400 million people have been brought out of poverty in China. There's been significant, particularly in the last 10 or 15 years, significant industrial development, scientific development. And indeed, the policy of China today is unique in the prominence that it places.
I actually had the figures.
Oh, yeah?
In 1980, 85% of the population was in extreme poverty.
Mm-hmm.
Now it's 10%.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Okay, so you get an idea. This is a process. And of course, in fact, the Chinese now have a satellite mission or an orbiter on the way to the moon. And with the idea that they will orbit the moon and then come back to Earth and land safely. Now, because they have a policy of developing their space capability and ultimately mining the moon. Now, what's really important about their perspective is that it's a perspective of development, ongoing development as the policy. So it's not just about the moon, it's mining helium, it's the development of fusion, but also ongoing cooperative development. Now, also Leni's going to go through some things in a little bit later. But one manifestation of this, to make the point about what we're doing, is that there was a conference in Europe, in Germany, that was last weekend. That conference was organized by the Schiller Institute, which was founded by Helga Zepp-LaRouche Lyndon LaRouche. And Helga, in particular, has been an international emissary for LaRouche, the policies of the LaRouche Political Action Committee, policies of unique economic development